The morning Frederick Barker rode into Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1883, the first thing anyone told him was not where to find water, not where to stable his horse, and not which saloons served the least watered-down whiskey. The first thing anyone told him was to stay as far away from Virginia Doyle as his horse could carry him, and to do it before sunset. He had been riding for 3 weeks straight out of Abilene, Kansas, following a rumor about a parcel of land south of the Sangre de Cristo foothills that was selling cheap on account of the former owner having met a disagreeable end involving a card game and a man with poor sportsmanship. Frederick was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of cattle driving, and deeply tired of working other men's land. He wanted his own. He had enough money saved to make it happen if the price was right, and the price, he had been told, was very right indeed. The man who warned him about Virginia Doyle was named Elmer Hobbs. Elmer was the kind of man who sat on the front porch of the general store from sunup to sundown and considered this a respectable occupation. He had a white beard that needed trimming and eyes the color of creek water in August, pale and a little murky, and he looked Frederick up and down with the thoroughness of a man who had seen every type come through Redemption Creek and knew instantly what category each one belonged to. New in town, Elmer said, though it was not really a question. Frederick tipped his hat. Just passing through, maybe, looking at some land. Which land? The Doyle parcel, South Quarter near the Canyon Ridge. Elmer was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that a man lets sit there for dramatic effect, Frederick would later realize. You want my advice? I have a feeling you are going to give it either way. Son, that land belongs to Virginia Doyle, and Virginia Doyle belongs to nobody and never has and never will, and she will tell you so herself in language that would make a mule skinner blush. She is stubborn past all reasoning. Every man who has tried to deal with her on that property has ridden out of here looking like he lost an argument with a badger. Elmer shook his head slowly. Just last month, a fellow came down from Santa Fe with a briefcase full of legal papers and a letter from a judge, and she sent him off on foot because she confiscated his horse as payment for trespassing. Judge's letter and all. Frederick looked down the main street of Redemption Creek. It was a decent-sized town for the territory, with a proper bank, a hotel called the Beaumont, a livery stable, 2 saloons, a church with a crooked steeple, and a cluster of adobe buildings that housed various businesses. The street was unpaved and dry as a bone, dust lifting off it in small spirals whenever the wind came through the gap between buildings. Stubborn past all reasoning, Frederick repeated, almost to himself. Yes, sir. That is exactly what she is. Frederick considered this for approximately 4 seconds. That sounds like my favorite kind of conversation, he said, and swung down off his horse. Elmer stared at him. You are either the bravest man I have ever met or the most foolish, and I cannot yet determine which. Neither can I, Frederick said pleasantly, and led his horse toward the livery stable. He got a room at the Beaumont Hotel, which cost him 50 cents a night, and came with a view of the alley behind the building and a mattress that had seen better decades. He ate supper at the hotel's small dining room, a plate of beef and beans that was better than he expected, and he listened to the talk around him with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years on cattle drives, learning that other people's conversations were a more reliable source of information than newspapers. What he learned about Virginia Doyle in that first evening filled in the picture considerably. She was 24 years old, the daughter of Patrick Doyle, an Irish immigrant who had come to New Mexico Territory in the late 1860s and built himself a cattle operation from nothing on a piece of hard land near Canyon Ridge. Patrick Doyle had died 3 years ago from a fever, leaving Virginia the operation, the land, and a debt to the Redemption Creek Savings Bank that was growing at a rate that made comfortable breathing difficult. Her mother had died when Virginia was 12, and she had no siblings. She had been running the ranch alone for 3 years, with a single hired hand named Cephas Gill, who was 62 years old and had more loyalty than good sense. She had turned down 2 formal offers to buy her out, one from a cattle baron named Aldous Marsh, who operated out of Las Vegas, New Mexico, and owned more of the territory than any single man ought to, and one from a land speculator out of Denver, whose name the hotel dining room could not agree on. She had also, apparently, fired 3 lawyers who attempted to represent her in negotiations, not because they were bad lawyers, but because they kept suggesting she compromise. "She will not compromise," said a man at the next table, a weather-beaten fellow in a canvas jacket who had introduced himself to his dinner companion as Bill Sutter, and who spoke about Virginia Doyle with the resigned admiration of a man who has tried and failed to move a mountain. "On anything. Ever. I tried to buy 2 acres off her east boundary 3 years back. Perfectly good offer, fair price. She said she would not sell 1 square foot of Doyle land as long as she drew breath, and possibly for some time after." Frederick finished his beans and thought about this. The next morning he rode out to the Doyle ranch. The land was stunning in the way that New Mexico Territory land was stunning, which was a kind of beauty that operated by its own rules entirely, and had nothing to do with the soft green prettiness of places farther east. The canyon ridge rose to the south in a wall of red and gold sandstone that caught the early light and threw it back at you in colors that seemed too vivid to be real. The grassland between the ridge and the ranch buildings was sparse but not worthless, good grazing land in the spring when the rains came. And the creek that gave the town its name ran through the east corner of the property in a line of silver that meant something in this dry country. The ranch house itself was adobe, low and thick-walled, with a covered porch running along the front and a garden patch to the side that showed evidence of serious effort and modest success. There were 2 outbuildings, a barn that needed paint but not structural repair, and a smaller shed. A corral held 4 horses. The whole place had the look of a property that was being held together by will and hard work rather than money, but held together it was. Frederick reined in at the gate, which was a proper wooden gate with the word DOYLE carved into the crossbar, and he sat there on his horse and looked at the place with the eye of a man who knew what land was worth and what work had gone into making it look like this. He did not get any further than the gate before the porch door opened. Virginia Doyle stepped out with a Winchester rifle held in both hands and her dark eyes fixed on him with an expression that could have stripped varnish off a barn door. She was not what he had pictured. He was not sure what he had pictured exactly. Some stern and angular woman perhaps, gray at the temples from worry, wearing the look of someone who had been fighting for too long. But Virginia Doyle was young, properly young, and she was striking in a way that had nothing to do with softness. She was tall for a woman, with dark hair pinned up under a battered hat that shaded a face all sharp angles and dark brows, and a mouth that was currently set in a line that meant business. She wore a practical work shirt and trousers and boots that had done their fair share of work, and she held that Winchester like it was an extension of her arms, natural and easy. "This is private property," she said. Her voice was clear and direct with just enough edge on it to leave no room for misunderstanding. "Good morning," Frederick said. She seemed briefly thrown by the pleasantness of this but recovered instantly. "I said this is private property. That sign on the gate is not decorative. I read it, Doyle Ranch. That is why I am here. I am looking for Virginia Doyle. You found her. And you have about 30 seconds to explain yourself before I explain why that gate is the most useful boundary you have crossed in your life." Frederick took his hat off. "My name is Frederick Barker, Miss Doyle. I came from Abilene. I heard you might be interested in selling." The silence that followed this statement had a specific quality to it, not the silence of consideration but the silence that precedes thunder. "Get off my land," Virginia said. "I have not made an offer yet. I do not need to hear an offer to know my answer. My answer is no. My answer has always been no. My answer will be no the day they put me in the ground, and if anyone tries to sell this land after that, I will haunt them until their hair turns white." She tilted the rifle slightly. "I suggest you turn that horse around, Mr. Barker." Frederick looked at her for a long moment. He had been told she was stubborn past all reasoning. He had said that was his favorite kind of conversation, and sitting there on his horse looking at Virginia Doyle with her rifle and her dark eyes and her absolute refusal to hear a single syllable of his argument, he found that this was still true. He found it true in a way he had not quite expected, a warmth somewhere behind his sternum that was entirely separate from the property question and entirely new. He put his hat back on. "All right, Miss Doyle. Good day to you." He turned his horse around and rode back to town. He did not go back the next day. He understood enough about stubborn people to know that pressing immediately was exactly the wrong approach. Instead, he spent the day making himself useful and visible in town in the way that a man does when he intends to stay. He helped the livery stable owner, a quiet Mexican man named Rodrigo Vasquez, repair a split fence post. He introduced himself properly to the hotel owner, a widow named Mrs. Callahan who ran the Beaumont with an iron discipline and an occasionally warm heart. He ate lunch at the saloon and played one round of cards with 3 cowboys passing through and won a modest amount without being obvious about it. He asked careful questions, not about Virginia Doyle specifically, but about the land, the water rights, the history of the area. He was building a picture, not just of the property but of the situation, and the picture that emerged was both more complex and more troubling than a simple real estate transaction. The debt Virginia owed the bank was real, and it was serious. She had borrowed against the property 2 years ago to get through a drought year and pay the property taxes, and the interest was compounding. The bank was owned jointly by 2 men, a Mr. Clifford Haynes and a silent partner named Aldous Marsh, the same cattle baron who had already tried to buy her out. Frederick turned this information over in his mind with the care it deserved. It was not a coincidence. Marsh wanted the Doyle land because the creek that ran through it was the only reliable water source for several miles in any direction, and whoever controlled that water controlled the grazing land around it for a considerable distance. He had not come here to involve himself in someone else's trouble. He had come for land. But information changed the shape of a situation, and Frederick Barker had never been a man who could unsee a thing once he had seen it. On the 3rd day, he rode back to the Doyle ranch. This time he did not ride to the gate. He rode along the east fence line, not on the property but beside it, following the creek upstream toward the canyon. He was not trespassing. He was taking a very thorough look at the land from a perfectly legal angle. He had been riding for perhaps 20 minutes when he heard a voice. "You are going to ride a rut in the ground if you keep circling my property like a turkey vulture." Virginia Doyle was sitting on the top rail of the east fence not 15 feet away, and he had been so absorbed in looking at the land that he had not seen her coming. She was eating an apple and watching him with an expression that was less hostile than the first time and more genuinely curious, though she clearly considered this a personal failing. "I am not on your property," he pointed out. "You are admiring it considerably from a very close distance. It is worth admiring. This is good land, Miss Doyle." "I know it is," she said flatly. "That is why it is mine." He stopped his horse and looked at her properly. In the morning light, without a rifle in her hands, the severity of her expression was balanced by something else, a steadiness in her eyes, an intelligence. She was watching him the way she would watch an unfamiliar animal, not with fear but with careful, professional attention. "How is the grazing this year?" he asked. She bit into her apple. "Why would I tell you that?" "Because I asked a genuine question, and I suspect you are tired of people who do not ask genuine questions." Something shifted fractionally in her expression. "It is decent," she said after a pause. "Better than last year. The spring rains came through properly." "How is the creek? Reliable flow? All year it comes from snowmelt up in the Sangers. Does not dry up even in a hard summer." She paused. "You know more about land than the last man they sent." "Nobody sent me," Frederick said. "I came on my own." She looked at him with the kind of scrutiny that made him feel like she was reading the small print of his character. "You do not work for Aldous Marsh." "Never heard of the man before I rode into this town 3 days ago. He is trying to take my land through the bank. He owns half of it, the bank and the mortgage on this property. He wants the water rights." Frederick said nothing for a moment, because this was more than she had needed to tell him, and the fact that she had told him anyway suggested she had thought about it and decided on a reason. He was not sure yet what that reason was. "That is a difficult position," he said carefully. "I am aware of my own position." She finished the apple and dropped the core on her side of the fence line. "What I do not understand, Mr. Barker, is why a man from Abilene with no connection to Aldous Marsh would come all the way down here to try to buy land that is not for sale. I want my own spread. I have been working cattle on other men's land for 10 years. I am tired of it. There is plenty of land in Kansas. Not cheap enough, and not this beautiful." He said this simply, meaning the land, and watched her expression to see whether she would take it as flattery about something else. She did not. She received it as the honest assessment of terrain that it was, which told him something useful. "It is not for sale," she said, but the temperature of the refusal had dropped several degrees from the rifle-on-the-porch version of 3 days ago. "I understand that," Frederick said. "Good morning, Miss Doyle." He rode back toward town, and this time when he passed the gate, he thought he heard the fence rail creak as she climbed down from it, and he thought maybe she watched him go a little longer than strictly necessary. He stayed in Redemption Creek. He told himself he was being sensible, gathering more information before deciding on his next move regarding the land. He helped Rodrigo Vasquez reshoe 3 horses over the next week, and proved quickly that he knew his way around a smithing operation, having worked one through a whole winter in Wyoming in 1879. He fixed the crooked steeple on the church on a Saturday morning, because the pastor asked politely, and it bothered him every time he looked at it. He won and lost a modest amount at cards with an impartiality that made the other players trust him, which was not nothing in a small town. He learned more about Aldous Marsh. Marsh was 53 years old, had come up from Texas after the war with a small herd and a large amount of ruthlessness, and had spent the intervening years acquiring land and water rights across the territory with methods that ranged from legal to merely legal-looking. He was not known for violence in the direct sense. He was known for patience, for finding the leverage point in a situation and applying pressure there with the slow, grinding certainty of a millstone. The bank mortgage on the Doyle property was a leverage point. Virginia was behind on her payments by 2 months, and the balloon payment on the principal was coming due in approximately 6 weeks. Frederick did the arithmetic and did not like what it produced. He saw Virginia Doyle twice in town that week. The first time was at the general store, where she was buying supplies with the careful, counting attention of a person who knows exactly what they can and cannot afford. She saw him and gave him a nod, not quite friendly but no longer hostile, the nod of someone who has categorized you as a known quantity and not a threat. He helped her carry her supplies to her wagon without asking permission, and she let him, which he suspected was a significant concession. "You are still here," she said. "I am," he agreed. "Most people who do not get what they want leave," she said. It was an observation, not quite a complaint. "I grew up being told the same thing about stubborn horses," Frederick said, "that they only become difficult because nobody ever took the time to understand what they actually needed." Virginia turned and looked at him. "Are you comparing me to a horse?" "I would never," he said with great seriousness. "A horse cannot argue back." The second time he saw her in town that week, she was coming out of the bank. She walked out with her chin up and her jaw set, and her eyes doing something complicated that she was clearly very determined not to let show. Frederick was across the street, and he watched her stand on the bank steps for a moment alone before she squared her shoulders and walked to her wagon. He went over, not immediately. He gave her a few minutes. "Bad news," he said. She looked at him. For a moment he thought she would say it was none of his business, which would have been entirely correct. Then she said, Haynes wants the first of the balloon payment in 3 weeks, not 6 weeks. 3. He claims there is a clause in the original mortgage document that allows acceleration of the payment schedule. She paused. I have not been able to find that clause in my copy of the documents. Do you have a lawyer? I had 3, she said dryly. I fired them all. Why? Because they kept telling me to settle, to take a partial offer, give up a portion of the land, agree to sell the water rights separately. That is not settling, that is surrendering. Frederick leaned against the hitching post and thought about this. Do you have the original mortgage document? Yes. Have you read the whole thing? She gave him a look that would have curdled milk at 10 paces. Of course I have read the whole thing. Did you read the addenda, the supplemental pages? Sometimes those get attached separately and filed differently at the recording office. A pause. A very small, almost imperceptible pause, but he caught it. I read what I was given, she said more carefully. It might be worth asking to see the recorded version at the county seat, he said. If Haynes is citing a clause you cannot find in your copy, either your copy is incomplete, which is an honest clerical error, or it is not, which is something else entirely. Virginia looked at him for a long moment. The complicated thing in her eyes moved through several phases. Why do you care? She said. If I lose the property, you could potentially buy it. I could, he said. But I do not want to buy it from a bank that manufactured a legal clause to steal it from a woman who built it with her own hands. That is not the land I am looking for. She was quiet for so long that he thought she would simply drive away. Then she said, the county seat is Cimarron, 2 days' ride. I know. I cannot leave the ranch for 2 days. I have 6 head that need rotating to the north pasture before the end of the month, and Cephas cannot manage it alone. Get the cattle rotated first, Frederick said. I will be here. She drove away without answering, but she did not say no. 4 days later, on a Tuesday morning, Virginia Doyle knocked on the door of his room at the Beaumont Hotel at 6 in the morning. When he opened the door, she was standing in the hallway fully dressed for travel with her jaw set and the look of a person who has thought something through carefully and arrived at a decision they are not entirely comfortable with. If you are going to be useful, she said, then be useful. We leave in an hour. It was the best invitation he had ever received. They rode to Cimarron. 2 days on the road through the dry, beautiful emptiness of the New Mexico territory, through the foothills, and across a stretch of high plateau grassland where the sky was so enormous it felt personal, where the horizon went on in every direction without apology, and the light changed every hour into something new. Virginia Doyle rode like someone born to it, which she had been, and she talked in the way that highly intelligent people talk when they have been working alone for too long and suddenly find themselves in the company of someone who can keep up. She talked about the land, about her father's history, about the cattle breeds best suited to the territory, about the water management system her father had built along the creek, and that she had extended in his last year when he was too sick to do it himself. She talked about the law, not from legal training but from the necessity of having had to understand it to survive, and she was sharp and clear and precise in her thinking, and Frederick kept up with every word, and added to the conversation when he had something to add and was quiet when he did not. She talked about Aldous Marsh with a cold, specific anger that was entirely different from the hot kind. Cold anger is the kind that has been lived with for a long time and has had all the unnecessary parts worn away until what remains is just the pure, essential core of it. He came to the house once, she said, on the first afternoon when they had stopped to water the horses at a shallow creek. After my father died. I was 21. He sat at my table and drank my coffee and offered to take the property and the debt off my hands in what he called a fair deal. He smiled the whole time. I told him to leave. He smiled, Frederick repeated. He knew what position I was in. He had put me in it partly. He knew the bank debt because he owned part of the bank. And he sat there and smiled like he was doing me a kindness. She paused. My father built that ranch from nothing. He came over from County Cork with $14 and a particular determination that it was possible to make something real in this country. And it was possible. He did it. And now a man who has spent his whole life taking what other people built is trying to take it, and he smiles while he does it. Frederick was quiet for a moment. "It will not happen," he said. She looked at him. "You cannot promise that." "No," he agreed, "but I intend to make it considerably more difficult." She held his gaze for a beat longer than comfortable, then turned back to her horse. But he noticed the set of her jaw had changed slightly, and it was not as tight as it had been. They camped the first night under a sky that was absurdly full of stars, the kind of sky you only got at altitude and distance from town, where the darkness was deep enough to show you everything. Virginia made camp with the efficient competence of someone who had been doing it all her life, and Frederick contributed to the effort without fuss, and they ate salt pork and biscuits and drank coffee and talked in the comfortable way of people who are discovering with some surprise that the other person is genuinely interesting. "Why Abilene?" she asked. "What were you doing there?" "Cattle drives. I came up the Kisham Trail 4 times. Then they moved the railhead and the business dried up, and I was working on a spread outside town. Good work, decent pay, someone else's cattle and someone else's land." He looked at the fire. "I have a sister in Missouri who thinks I should come home and be respectable. She writes me letters with a very consistent message." "What do you write back?" "That I am deeply respectable in my own way and she should have more faith in me." He paused. "She has not been persuaded." Virginia almost smiled. He caught the edge of it before she put it away. "You do not seem like a man without direction," she said. "I am a man with a very specific direction," he said. "I want land, my own, something I built. I am not interested in inheriting it or marrying into it or taking it from someone who cannot hold it. I want to earn it." "That is a more principled position than most people in your situation would take," she said, carefully neutral. "My father was a farmer in Ohio," Frederick said. "He worked 30 years on land he did not own for a man who did. When the man died, the family sold it out from under him, and he had nothing to show for any of it except 30 years of his life. I swore I would never be in that position." He looked at her. "I understand something about why you will not let this land go." This time she did not put the almost smile away quite fast enough. They reached Cimarron the next afternoon and went directly to the county recorder's office, which was a small adobe room attached to the courthouse, tended by a meticulous little man named Mr. Abner Cord, who kept every document in precise alphabetical and chronological order, and regarded the safe storage of records as a sacred trust. Frederick explained what they needed with a calm specificity that had Mr. Cord pulling files within 3 minutes, and they spread the recorded mortgage documents on the counter, and Virginia and Frederick read through them together, side by side, their heads close over the papers. Frederick found it, or rather, Virginia found it first, and he confirmed it simultaneously, and they looked at each other over the paper with the specific, charged look of two people who have just found the thing they came for. There was an addendum. It had been filed separately, as he had suspected, and it contained a payment acceleration clause, but it also contained something that Clifford Haynes had apparently not mentioned, or had perhaps hoped Virginia would not notice. The acceleration clause required 30 days written notice to be delivered in person, witnessed by 2 adult residents of the county, before it could be invoked. Haynes had sent a letter. An unsigned letter through the post. "That is not valid service," Frederick said. "No," Virginia said softly, "it is not. He either did not read his own documents carefully or he assumed you would not read them at all." She straightened up. Her eyes were very bright. "He assumed wrong." Mr. Cord, who had been listening with the quiet attention of a man who takes his record-keeping duties personally, said, "I can provide you a certified copy of the full document, including the addendum, for 25 cents. "Please," Virginia said. She paid for it herself, 25 cents from the small leather purse she kept inside her coat, and she folded the certified copy and put it inside her coat over her heart with the careful deliberateness of a woman securing something irreplaceable. And when she looked up, Frederick was watching her, and something passed between them in that moment that neither of them commented on, but that both of them felt. They had dinner at Cimarron's only proper restaurant before the return ride, a place that served lamb stew and corn bread, and charged 15 cents for a meal that was worth 20. They sat across from each other at a small table by the window, and the conversation moved differently than it had before, easier and somehow more personal, as if finding the document together had shifted the ground between them. "What happens next?" Frederick asked. "I take this to Haynes tomorrow and inform him that his acceleration notice was not properly served and is therefore invalid, and that I have 6 weeks remaining on my original schedule. Then I use 6 weeks to find the money I need for the balloon payment." She said this with certainty, but the certainty had a thin edge to it that he heard. "How much is the balloon payment?" she told him. He did not let his expression change. "That is considerable," he said. "I know it is. Do you have any livestock you could move?" "Some, not enough. I have been thinking about approaching Marcus Webb at the Double M about a grazing lease on the north pasture. He needs the grass and I need the income." She looked at her stew. "I have options. I do not have comfortable options, but I have options." "If you need additional options," he said carefully, "I have some savings." Virginia put her spoon down and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts touched and alarmed. Frederick. It was the first time she had used his given name. He felt it land somewhere in the vicinity of his ribs. "I am not suggesting a gift or a loan with expectations," he said quickly. "I am suggesting a legitimate business arrangement, a grazing lease, the same as you would offer Webb, but on better terms because I am not Webb and I am offering in good faith." "You would be leasing land you tried to buy," she said. "I would be paying a woman fair price to use her land legally, which is entirely different from trying to acquire it." He met her eyes. "And I would be staying in the territory, which I intend to do regardless. I have been looking at a smaller parcel 2 miles north of yours, nothing like the scope of your operation, but a starting point. I could use water access from the creek. You could use the lease income." She was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the Cimarron street. "You are a complicated man, Frederick Barker," she said at last. "I try to be straightforward," he said, surprised. "Straightforward men do not ride 3 days to help a woman they have known for a week fight a corrupt banker," she said. "They buy the land when it gets foreclosed and tell themselves they are not responsible for what came before." She turned back to him. "You could have done that. You could have waited 6 weeks and bought this property at auction and it would have been a good deal." "Yes," he agreed. "Why did you not?" He thought about how to answer this honestly. "Because I met you," he said, "and I do not want land that came to me that way. And because it is wrong. What Marsh is doing is wrong. And I find it difficult to be uninvolved in a situation that is clearly wrong when I have the means to be of some use." Virginia studied him. The restaurant was quiet around them, the evening settling into the kind of warm dark that came on fast in the high desert, the lamplight making everything softer and more intimate than the desert day. "The grazing lease," she said. "I will think about it." It was not yes, but it was not no, and from Virginia Doyle, the distance between the two was the most significant terrain he had ever tried to cross. They rode back to Redemption Creek the next day. The return journey had a different quality than the outward one, lighter somehow, and the conversation moved between serious and playful in a way that felt natural. Virginia had a dry, precise sense of humor that she deployed with perfect timing and absolute commitment. And Frederick, who had always believed that the ability to make a stubborn woman laugh was one of the great underrated achievements of human endeavor, found himself working for it in a way that was genuinely enjoyable. She told him about her father's attempts to grow tomatoes in the desert soil, a project that had defeated every effort for 4 years before producing one summer of such extraordinary abundance that they had eaten tomatoes at every meal and given them to every neighbor within riding distance, and still had to leave some on the vine. She told it with love and humor, and a precision of detail that made the late Patrick Doyle come alive for a few minutes in the high desert afternoon, and Frederick listened with the full attention it deserved. He told her about a cattle drive in 1880 that had gone approximately everything wrong that a cattle drive could go wrong, including but not limited to a river crossing that had been misjudged, a stampede triggered by a particularly aggressive prairie dog, and a cook who had turned out to be cooking for the wrong outfit and had been riding with them for 3 days before anyone noticed. Virginia laughed at the prairie dog, genuinely, completely, with no effort to put it away. It was the best sound he had heard in a long time. They arrived back in Redemption Creek as the sun was setting, and the town's main street was washed in the long golden light that made everything look biblical and temporary, and Virginia pulled her horse up at the point where she would turn south toward her ranch and he would continue straight to the hotel, and they sat there for a moment in the way of two people who have been in each other's company for 2 days and are not entirely sure how to conclude that. "Thank you," she said, "for coming, for finding the addendum." "You found it," he said. "I merely suspected it existed. That is more than anyone else has done." She looked at him steadily. "The grazing lease. Come to the ranch on Saturday, and we will discuss the terms." She rode south. He watched her go for longer than he had any particular excuse for. The confrontation with Clifford Haynes at the Redemption Creek Savings Bank the following morning was not witnessed by Frederick, but it was witnessed by enough people in the small town to have become a well-detailed story by lunchtime. Virginia had walked into the bank at 9 in the morning, placed the certified copy of the full mortgage document on Haynes's desk, and explained in precise, measured language exactly why his acceleration notice was invalid, what the proper legal requirements for such notice were, and what she would do if he attempted to pursue the matter through improper channels, which included writing to the territorial governor's office, the land office in Santa Fe, and the district court judge in Cimarron, all of whom, she mentioned, had been known to take a dim view of predatory lending practices. Haynes had sputtered. Haynes had threatened. Haynes had looked at the document with the expression of a man who genuinely had not read it carefully enough, which was the most honest moment in an otherwise dishonest career. Virginia had collected her document, said good morning in a tone that meant nothing of the kind, and walked out. By Saturday, the story had improved in the telling to include a second confrontation in the street, 2 different versions of what Haynes had said, and one entirely apocryphal account in which Virginia had actually owned the mortgage documents the whole time and had been waiting for the right moment. None of this was true, but the emotional truth of it, that Virginia Doyle had won a round, was accurate, and the town of Redemption Creek took considerable pleasure in it. Frederick rode out to the Doyle Ranch on Saturday with a bottle of decent wine from the hotel bar and a set of notes he had made about grazing lease structures, which covered approximately half a page and were written in the clear, economical hand of a man who was genuinely trying to be fair. Cephas Gill met him at the gate. Cephas was 62 years old, built like a man who had been shrinking for decades but had not quite given up, with a face like weathered cedar and eyes that were sharper than his ramshackle appearance suggested. He looked Frederick over with the thorough, unhurried assessment of a man who had been watching Virginia Doyle's interests for 3 years and took the responsibility seriously. "You the fellow from Abilene," he said. "Frederick Barker." "Yes, sir." Cephas considered him. "Virginia says you helped with the bank business." "I had a useful thought. She did the actual work." This answer seemed to satisfy Cephas on some level, because he stepped aside from the gate with the air of a verdict being rendered. "She is in the barn, 3rd stall." Virginia was examining a horse's foreleg with the focused attention of a trained professional, which she largely was, having been raised around horses her whole life. She looked up when Frederick's shadow fell across the stall door. "You are on time," she said. "I try to be." "Cephas likes you," she said, in a tone that implied this was meaningful information. "He does not like anyone. I noticed he had opinions. He has been protecting this ranch for 3 years. He worked for my father for 15 years before that." She straightened up, satisfied with whatever she had been checking. "Come up to the house." They sat on the porch with the wine, which Virginia accepted with a faint surprise that suggested she had not expected thoughtfulness in the gesture, and they negotiated the grazing lease with the genuine, interested attention of two people who both knew land and both intended to be fair. It took 2 hours and involved several points of genuine disagreement, and one period of about 20 minutes where neither of them spoke because they were both thinking. And it ended with terms that were good for both of them, and sealed with a handshake that lasted slightly longer than a business handshake strictly needed to. Frederick's hand was large and rough from years of work, and hers was not soft either, strong and capable. And when they shook, he felt her grip, which was solid and direct, and he met her eyes and she met his. And they were standing on the porch of the Doyle Ranch in the spring afternoon, with the red canyon behind them and the creek glinting in the east pasture. And the air between them was thick with something that had been building for 2 weeks, and was becoming increasingly difficult to pretend was not there. "You will stay for supper," she said. It was not entirely a question. "I would be glad to," he said. Cephas joined them for supper, which Virginia cooked with the same no-nonsense efficiency she brought to everything. A proper meal of roasted pork and cornbread and preserved green beans, and, unexpectedly, a dried apple pie that tasted like someone had put real effort into it. They ate at the kitchen table and talked about cattle and water rights, and the spring calf count, and the best approach to the north pasture rotation. And Cephas said almost nothing, but ate everything with concentrated approval. After supper, while Virginia washed the dishes and Cephas had retired to the bunkhouse, Frederick sat at the kitchen table and looked at the room around him. The house had the feel of a place that had been a full family home and had gradually adapted itself to being lived in by one person, smaller than it was built for in the deepest sense. There were photographs on the shelf above the fireplace, a stiff formal portrait of a man and woman who must have been Virginia's parents, young in the picture, and a more informal one of a man on horseback who had Patrick Doyle's features and Virginia's posture. There was a bookshelf with 20 or 30 volumes, a Bible and some agricultural almanacs, and several novels that showed the kind of reading where that comes from actually being read, and not just displayed. Virginia came to the table with the coffee pot and poured without asking. She sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at him with a directness that he was coming to recognize as simply the way she engaged with anything that mattered to her. "Why do I trust you?" she said. It was a genuine question, asked with the puzzlement of someone who does not understand their own instincts. "I could not tell you," he said honestly. "I hope the instinct is right." "I trusted the first lawyer I hired," she said. "He turned out to be friends with Haynes's associate and was reporting back on my legal strategy. I trusted the second one slightly less, and he turned out to have been paid to recommend settlement. I stopped trusting people fairly thoroughly after that." "That is reasonable," Frederick said. "And yet here you are, sitting in my kitchen." She looked into her coffee. "You came here to buy my land." "I came here looking for land," he said. "The situation changed." "What situation changed?" He looked at her, and the kitchen was warm and the night outside the window was deep and full of stars. And Frederick Barker, who was not a man of excessive words or dramatic declarations, said the truth because it was simpler and more honest than the alternative. "You changed it," he said. "By being exactly what everyone told me you were. By being so entirely yourself that the original purpose of the trip became considerably less interesting than the person I met on the way." The silence lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "That is a very forthright thing to say," Virginia said carefully. "I am a forthright person." "You are," she agreed. "And then, I notice you are not telling me what to do about it." "I would not dream of it," he said. "I have heard what happens to people who try to tell you what to do." She looked at him for a long moment, and there was a light in her eyes that was new, or perhaps not new but newly visible, the way stars are always there but only show themselves when the light around them goes away. "You should come for supper again next Saturday," she said. "I will," he said. He rode back to Redemption Creek in the dark with the warmth of the evening wrapped around him like something he wanted to keep. The weeks that followed were among the best Frederick Barker could remember. He took possession of the small northern parcel he had been looking at and began the considerable work of making it into something. It was 30 acres, a fraction of Virginia's spread, with a small creek tributary and a building site that needed everything from the foundation up. He bought lumber from the mill in Cimarron on his second trip there, arranged its delivery with the help of Rodrigo Vasquez, who turned out to know everyone within 40 miles and could arrange almost anything with enough notice, and began building a proper house with the systematic, patient energy of a man who has been working toward something for a very long time. He worked the Doyle North pasture 3 days a week under the terms of the lease, rotating his small starter herd of 18 cattle alongside Virginia's in the arrangement they had agreed on. This brought him to the Doyle ranch regularly and in a practical capacity, and the regularity was its own kind of progress. He and Virginia developed a rhythm. It was a ranching rhythm first: work, talk, cattle and water and weather, and the perpetual arithmetic of making a marginal enterprise survive. But it was other things too. They rode the fence line together on Tuesday mornings in a pattern that began as practical inspection and became something they both looked forward to and neither of them examined too closely. They argued, regularly and with genuine heat, about cattle management, about water schedules, about the best approach to the eastern grazing rotation, and the arguments had a quality that Frederick found more satisfying than agreement, because Virginia's stubbornness in an argument was matched by her absolute fairness in one, and she would change her position the moment she became convinced she was wrong, which happened exactly as often as she was wrong and not a single time more. He brought her books from the hotel bar's small lending library when he found ones that matched what he knew of her interests, and she lent him her father's almanacs with careful instructions about their condition on return, which he observed to the letter. She made coffee every morning in a cast-iron pot that was older than either of them, and produced coffee of such remarkable quality that he privately suspected the pot itself deserved the credit. Cephas watched all of this with the silent, comprehensive attention of a man who has decided something and is waiting for the right moment to say it aloud. One afternoon in late May, when Frederick was helping repair the north fence and Cephas was working alongside him, the old man said, without preamble and without looking up from the wire he was stretching, "She has not let anyone get close since her father died." Frederick said nothing. "Her father was the last person she let herself need," Cephas said. "After he went, she decided needing people was a liability she could not afford." He paused. "She is wrong about that, but she is Virginia, so changing her mind requires evidence, not argument." "I am aware," Frederick said. "You are patient," Cephas said, with the tone of a man giving a considered verdict. "That is the right approach." He stretched the last length of wire taut and fastened it. "Thought you should know." It was the most Cephas had said in any single conversation, and Frederick received it with the gravity it deserved. The trouble, when it came from Aldous Marsh directly. It was a Wednesday in early June when Marsh rode into Redemption Creek with 2 men Frederick did not recognize but identified immediately by type. They were the kind of men who existed in the territory in numbers, hard men who worked for whoever was paying, whose specific skills were not the kind that got listed in legal advertisements. Marsh himself was a large man going to wait, with a gray beard and an expensive suit that looked wrong in a saddle, and the particular confidence of a man who had not been told no in a meaningful way for a long time. He went to the bank first, and then he went to the hotel, and Frederick was in the hotel dining room having lunch when Marsh came in and sat down across from him with the deliberate casualness of a man making a point about who has the home advantage. "Frederick Barker," Marsh said. It was not a question. "You have me," Frederick said and went on eating. "I understand you have taken a lease on the Doyle North pasture." "I have." You are building on the Ellison parcel to the north. Also correct. Marsh folded his hands on the table with the look of a man conducting a business meeting. I have substantial interests in this area, Mr. Barker. Water interests primarily. The Doyle property sits on the only reliable water in a considerable range. I intend to have it eventually. The mortgage situation will resolve itself in 6 weeks. The original schedule, yes, Frederick said. Miss Doyle is making arrangements. So I understand, Marsh said, and something moved behind his eyes. I came to offer you something. I will buy your lease from you, your lease and your claim on the northern parcel at double what you paid. Take the money, find land somewhere else. There is no shortage of available land in the territory. Frederick put down his fork and looked at Aldous Marsh with the kind of directness that does not need to be hostile to be clear. No, thank you, he said. I would think about that carefully, Marsh said. I have thought about it for approximately 20 seconds, which is what it deserves. Frederick picked up his fork again. Was there anything else? Marsh looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who is recalculating an estimate. You are sweet on Virginia Doyle, he said. I have a legitimate business relationship with Miss Doyle, Frederick said evenly. Of course you do. Marsh stood up. I would like you to understand that my position does not change, and that people who position themselves between me and a legitimate business objective have a tendency to find the territory less hospitable than they expected. Frederick met his eyes. I appreciate the clarity, he said, and went back to his lunch. After Marsh left the dining room, Frederick sat for a moment and thought carefully. The 2 men Marsh had brought were still in town. He had seen them outside. He rode out to the Doyle ranch that afternoon, not Tuesday, not their usual time, and found Virginia in the barn with Cephas going over the cattle ledger. She looked up when he came in. Something in his expression told her instantly. Marsh, she said. He came to town today. He offered to buy my lease. What did you tell him? No. She held his gaze for a moment, and the look in her eyes was complicated, gratitude and something more than that. Something that looked like it had been waiting a long time to have somewhere to go. He brought those men to make a point, she said. Yes. I would not leave Cephas or yourself alone on the property for the next few days. I am not leaving my own property, Virginia said immediately. I know. I mean have someone with you, both of you. I do not think Marsh will move to direct action. He prefers legal manipulation, but direct action is not impossible. I have handled Marsh for 3 years, Virginia said. I know you have. You have handled him brilliantly. I am asking you to let me help you handle this particular moment, because there are 3 of them and 2 of you, and I am better placed to watch the town side of this than either of you. He said it straight, plainly, with no suggestion that she needed protection, merely the factual argument that cooperation was more effective than independence in this specific situation. She looked at him for a long moment. This was the longest pause he had seen from her on a direct request. Then she said, "All right." He stayed at the ranch for the next 3 days. He slept in the small back room that Cephas was not using, which was barely large enough for a cot and a lantern, and he spent the days working alongside Cephas on the stock rotation, while keeping the kind of relaxed, general attention to the boundaries of the property that looked like nothing in particular and meant something very specific. Marsh's 2 men rode past the south boundary on the 2nd day. They did not stop. They looked. Frederick was visible, working the south fence alongside Cephas, and they looked at him and kept riding, and nothing happened. In the evenings he and Virginia sat on the porch after supper and talked in the way they had been talking for weeks, except that proximity and duration had made the talking more open, the edges of the conversation softer in the places where conversation becomes personal, and more honest in the places where it becomes real. She told him about the year after her father died, not just the financial facts of it but the weight of it, waking up every morning in a house that had become too large for one person, and going through the work anyway, because the work was what her father had built and leaving it would have been a betrayal she could not live with. She told it without self-pity, with the matter-of-fact recounting of events that have already been survived, and Frederick listened with the full attention it deserved and did not offer comfort that minimized it. "Did you never think about selling?" he asked. "Not to Marsh, just selling, going somewhere else, starting something different." She thought about it honestly. "Once," she said, "in the second winter. I had a fever and I was alone for 4 days because Cephas was in town, and I lay in that bed and thought about what it would be like to be somewhere easier, somewhere with less fighting." She looked out at the dark pasture. "And then I got better and walked outside and saw the canyon in the morning light, and I knew I could not leave. Not because I am stubborn." Well, the corner of her mouth moved. "Not only because I am stubborn, but because this place is mine. My father is in this land. I am in this land. It would be like leaving myself." Frederick looked at her profile, the strong line of her jaw, the dark eyes that held the distant light, and he thought about Ohio and his father and 30 years on someone else's land and the absolute clarity of knowing what you were working toward. "I understand that completely," he said quietly. She turned and looked at him, and the distance between them on the porch was not large, and had been not large for some time, and she seemed to become aware of it simultaneously with him, and neither of them moved. "Frederick," she said softly, the way she had said it in the restaurant in Cimarron, like his name was something she was trying on for fit and finding that it fit. "Virginia," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The canyon was dark and immense at their backs, and the stars were doing their extraordinary thing overhead, and Frederick Barker, who was a patient man but was also a man of clear intentions when his intentions were clear, said, "I would very much like to kiss you, and I want to say it plainly so that you can tell me whether that is something you would like or whether it is something you would prefer I did not do." A pause. The kind of pause that has a quality of held breath. "I appreciate the directness," Virginia Doyle said, and leaned forward and kissed him. It was brief and certain, and everything that Virginia Doyle did with her whole self, complete and unambiguous, and offered without reservation. When she drew back, she looked at him with the same clear eyes and said, "I have been thinking about that for 3 weeks." 2.5, he said. 3, she said firmly. He smiled. She smiled. It was not at all like the almost smiles he had been collecting since the first day. It was a real one, full and unguarded, and it rearranged several things in his chest in ways that felt permanent. Marsh's men left Redemption Creek on the 4th day, and Marsh himself followed on the 5th. The immediate pressure was reduced, but the balloon payment deadline was still 6 weeks away, and the sum was still large, and Virginia's options were still limited. Frederick returned to his own parcel and his building work, and the Tuesday morning fence rides continued. And now there was something openly acknowledged between them that had only been implicit before. Nothing dramatic, but present. A warmth that had a name now. The grazing lease arrangement was producing income for Virginia, and Marcus Webb at the Double M had agreed to the North Pasture lease she had proposed, which added more. She had also sold 6 head at the Cimarron livestock market in early June at a good price, because she had held them to the right weight at the right time, which required exactly the kind of patient management she excelled at. Frederick had been making calculations. He had savings, solid savings from a decade of cattle driving and a few good seasons of work, and he had spent some of it on the northern parcel, on lumber and supplies for the house he was building, but there was a meaningful amount remaining. He had not been willing to simply offer it as a loan because he understood Virginia well enough to know that accepting money with an emotional attachment to the person offering, it felt differently to her than a business arrangement, and that she would resist it on principle. He arrived at a solution that was both legal and logical, and gave neither of them any reason to feel the other had sacrificed something. He went to Virginia on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of June with a written proposal, a document he had drafted with the care of someone who knows the other party, will read it thoroughly, and argue anything that is not exactly right. She read it twice slowly, the way she read everything. A formal business partnership, Co-ownership of the water rights along the shared creek boundary, with defined usage rights for both properties proportional to the size of each operation. In exchange for the water rights recognition, he would provide the remaining funds needed for her balloon payment, secured against the water rights themselves rather than the land, so that her title to the Doyle Ranch was not further encumbered. She read it twice, and then she put it down on the kitchen table and looked at him. "This is a very generous valuation of the water rights," she said. "It is a fair valuation," he said carefully. "You could have put a lower number." "I could have. I did not want to." He met her eyes. "It is a fair deal, Virginia. You get the payment covered. I get legal recognition of the water access I need for my operation. We are both better off." She looked at the document again. "You drew this up yourself." "I had the hotel owner review it. She has some legal background from her late husband's business dealings, and she is sharp enough to be useful." Virginia traced a line of the document with her finger, a habitual gesture he had come to recognize as her thinking posture. "If I accept this," she said, "we are business partners." "Yes. That is complicated, given." She looked up at him. "Given what there is between us," he finished. "Yes, it is more complicated than a straightforward transaction. That is why I wrote it down formally instead of just offering you money, which would have felt like something different and which you would have refused." She held his gaze. "You know me rather well for someone I have known for 7 weeks. You are not particularly difficult to know," he said. "You are very clearly yourself." "People usually find that difficult," she said. "I find it refreshing," he said, with such absolute sincerity that she looked away first. She signed the document. He signed it. Mrs. Callahan witnessed it as a notary, because it turned out that among her many organizational accomplishments, Mrs. Callahan had a notary commission that her late husband had arranged for convenience, and that she had maintained out of the same practical competence that governed everything else in her life. The balloon payment was made to the Redemption Creek Savings Bank on the 20th of July, 1883, 10 days before the legitimate deadline, paid in full, in cash, by Virginia Doyle. Clifford Haynes received it with the expression of a man swallowing something unpleasant, and wrote the receipt with hands that were not entirely steady. The mortgage on the Doyle Ranch was fully discharged. The bank held no further claim. Aldous Marsh received word in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and the territory's collective perception was that he was not pleased. He sent a letter to Haynes that Haynes burned, but that Haynes later described, under the loosening influence of considerable whiskey at the saloon's bar one winter evening, as the kind of letter that makes you glad you are not the person it is written about. But there was nothing to be done. The mortgage was paid. The land was clear. Virginia Doyle had won, thoroughly and on her own terms. The day the receipt came back from the bank and Virginia stood on her own porch holding it, Frederick was there. He had ridden over in the afternoon and found her reading the document in the orange evening light with a stillness that was very different from her usual active energy. She looked up when he came up the porch steps, and her dark eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with tears, though it was adjacent, the brightness of something long carried being finally, fully set down. She held the receipt out to him, and he looked at it and looked at her and said, "Your father would be glad." She pressed her lips together for a moment. "He would have liked you," she said, and the way she said it told him exactly how much that meant. He crossed the porch, and she was not a woman who cried easily or asked to be held, but she was a woman who had been holding something enormous for 3 years and now stood on the other side of it. And when he put his arms around her, she leaned into him with her head against his shoulder and let out a long, slow breath that was 3 years of not being able to rest properly finally leaving her body. They stayed like that for a while, on the porch in the evening light with the canyon at their backs, and the creek catching the sunset in the east and everything in its right place around them. "I have something to tell you," he said, after a time. She pulled back and looked at him, ready as always for whatever came next. "The house on the northern parcel is nearly finished," he said. "I will have a proper roof on it by the end of the month, and I have been thinking about what happens after that, about what kind of operation I want to build. About what kind of life I want to build." He paused, because he was a straightforward man, and this was the most important thing he had been straightforward about in his life. "I want to ask you a question, and I want you to know before I ask it that the answer is entirely yours, and I will not push, and I will not argue, and I will accept whatever you say, even if it takes time and even if the time is long." "Frederick," she said with patient sharpness, "ask, will you marry me?" She looked at him. A clear, complete, direct look with all of herself in it. The same look she turned on the land she loved, on the work she did, on every conversation that mattered to her. "Yes," she said, without the pause he had been prepared to wait through. "I will." The wedding was in October, when the New Mexico sky had turned its autumn blue, which was a blue so deep and specific it looked painted. The church with the now properly straight steeple was full, because Redemption Creek was the kind of town that took a wedding seriously, and because Virginia Doyle getting married to the man who had helped her keep her land was a story the town had been following with proprietary interest for months. Mrs. Callahan made sure Frederick's good shirt was properly pressed, because she had appointed herself to that task 3 days before the wedding and did not take her appointments lightly. Cephas Gill, who had dressed for the occasion in a suit that had last been worn at Patrick Doyle's funeral and had been carefully maintained since, stood up with them, not as a formal groomsman, but simply because it was correct that he should be there and everyone knew it. Virginia wore a cream-colored dress that had belonged to her mother, and that she had altered herself to fit her taller frame, and she walked down the aisle of the Redemption Creek Church with her chin up, and her dark eyes fixed on Frederick Barker at the altar, with the complete, unguarded look that she had been slowly learning to let be visible. Frederick watched her come and felt every step in his chest. The pastor, a earnest young man who had come to Redemption Creek from Philadelphia with great faith, and gradually acquired a practical wisdom that the territory had not been optional about providing, read the ceremony with appropriate solemnity and some warmth, and when he came to the part about anyone objecting, there was a beat of silence during which Elmer Hobbs, on the front porch of the general store, could be heard saying something that no one in the church could quite make out, but that sounded like approval. They exchanged their vows in clear voices. Virginia's was steady and direct, her eyes on his the whole time, and Frederick's was steady and direct in the same way, and when the pastor pronounced them married, Cephas Gill clapped once slowly, and the whole church followed. The reception was held in the hotel dining room, cleared of its usual tables and set with everything Mrs. Callahan and the 3 other women who had organized it could produce on a budget that was generous but not excessive, which turned out to be considerable. Rodrigo Vasquez brought a guitar, and 2 of his relatives brought fiddles, and there was dancing that lasted until 10 at night, which was extremely late for a town that generally operated on ranch hours. Frederick danced with his wife, which was a phrase he turned over in his mind several times in the course of the evening, with the fresh and extraordinary pleasure of something brand new. Virginia danced with the focused physical competence she brought to everything, and with a freedom of expression she did not always allow herself, and they danced together well, which he suspected was not a surprise to either of them. At one point during the evening, Elmer Hobbs appeared, having walked from the general store to the hotel specifically, which was 11 steps and required significant motivation. He found Frederick at the refreshment table and stood next to him and looked at Virginia, who was talking to Mrs. Callahan across the room with the animation of a woman who was, Frederick noticed, genuinely and completely happy. "I told you to stay away from her," Elmer said. "You did," Frederick agreed. "You did not take my advice." "No." Elmer watched Virginia for another moment. "You were right not to," he said, and went back to his porch. The life they built was its own kind of story, one that played out in the daily texture of work and decision and conversation, that is the actual material of a life, rather than the dramatic events that bookend it. They merged the practical operations of the 2 properties gradually, with the careful, argued-through agreements that characterized everything they did together, and the combined operation was stronger for the combination. Frederick's northern parcel, which he had built up over the following year with 2 more purchases of adjacent land that became available, gave them better grass range in the spring and summer, and Virginia's creek access and canyon shelter made the joint winter operation considerably more viable than either had been separately. They hired 2 more hands by the spring of 1884, young men from Cimarron who were reliable and learnable, and who quickly understood that Virginia Doyle Barker ran an operation where the work was done correctly or not at all, and adjusted themselves accordingly. Cephas, who had announced his intention to retire approximately every 6 months for 3 years before Virginia arrived in his life, continued to do no such thing. He worked slightly less, and he deferred more of the daily decisions, but he was present every morning, and his particular knowledge of the property and its specific tendencies was a resource that could not be replaced. Frederick treated him with the respect owed to a man who had kept something important alive until it could keep itself, and Cephas received this with the gruff, silent acknowledgement of a man who does not need praise to know it is being given. Virginia was 3 months pregnant when they understood it, which took them both a moment to fully process, because they had been so completely absorbed in the work of building the operation that the particular signs had been easily attributed to other things. She announced it to Frederick on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1884, on their usual fence-line ride, with the same directness she brought to everything. "I believe we are having a child," she said matter-of-factly, as they sat their horses at the east boundary. Frederick was quiet for a moment. The morning was bright and still, and the creek was high from the spring melt, and everything around them was the specific, vivid green of a New Mexico spring that made the rest of the year's colors seem like memory. "Are you certain?" "I am rarely uncertain about things I choose to say out loud." He looked at her, and the light was in her eyes, that particular brightness, and he thought of her father's ranch and her mother's dress, and 3 years of holding something enormous alone, and the way she had leaned into his shoulder on the porch the day the mortgage was paid, and he felt something so large and complete it did not have a name beyond this is everything. "Good morning, Virginia," he said softly. She smiled. "The full one, the real one, the one that rearranged things." "Good morning, Frederick." Their son was born in December of 1884, in the house on the northern parcel that had grown considerably from the small structure Frederick had built in his first months in the territory, because they had added 2 rooms in the year after the wedding and another the year after that. Virginia had decided that the northern house had better winter shelter, and that they would use it as the main house in the cold months, and she had made this decision with such complete logical justification that Frederick, who privately thought she also simply preferred the view to the south from that specific porch, agreed without argument. The boy was named Patrick Frederick Barker, Patrick for Virginia's father and Frederick for his own, and he came into the world with a substantial opinion about the matter that he expressed loudly and continuously for some minutes, before settling into the observation of his new surroundings with the wide, unfocused attention of someone encountering territory for the first time. Cephas Gill, who had ridden to town for the doctor and back in the kind of weather that would have stopped a younger man, sat in the kitchen of the northern house with his 3rd cup of coffee and said, when Virginia placed the baby in his arms with the confidence of a woman who trusts who she trusts, "He looks like his grandfather." He said it quietly and with great seriousness, and Virginia looked at the weathered, careful face of the man who had kept her father's ranch alive and then kept her, and she said, "I know." Aldous Marsh, in the continuing story that the territory told about him, found his water interests complicated the following year by the development of a proper irrigation authority in the region, organized in part through the land office in Santa Fe, which divided water rights along documented and surveyed lines that made it considerably more difficult for any single party to monopolize a water source. Frederick had spent a significant amount of time in Santa Fe in the winter of 1884, discussing land use patterns with the territorial administration, not specifically about marsh, but in a general way that made the eventual policy outcome a logical result. Virginia, when she learned the details, told him she would have done it herself eventually. He told her he knew. She told him she was glad someone had been impatient. He told her it was the most significant compliment she had ever given him. A second child came in the spring of 1887, a daughter they named Eileen Margaret Barker, for Virginia's Irish grandmother and for Mrs. Callahan, who had been in their lives with consistent, practical affection since the beginning, and who received the news of her namesake with the dignified, deeply moved composure of a woman who has learned to contain large feelings in small expressions. Patrick was 2 years old by then and had firmly established himself as a person of definite opinions and remarkable physical energy, qualities that the surrounding adult population attributed to his mother, with a unanimity that Virginia found both accurate and slightly wearing. He had his father's coloring, and his mother's eyes and Cephas Gill's absolute inability to sit still for more than 90 seconds at a stretch, which may have been environmental. Eileen was quieter from the first days, with a calm watchfulness that seemed to take everything in, and she was the first person to reliably make Cephas Gill laugh out loud, which she accomplished at the age of 8 months by the simple method of looking at him with an expression of complete solemn assessment, and then, having concluded her evaluation, breaking into a smile of such uncomplicated delight that Cephas, who was 69 years old and had not laughed like that in longer than he could easily remember, had no defense against it. By 1888, the Barker operation covered nearly 400 acres and ran close to 200 head of cattle, making it one of the larger working ranches in that stretch of the territory. They had 3 full-time hired hands and a part-time arrangement with a pair of brothers from a neighboring ranch during the spring and fall busy seasons. The water rights partnership that had been the foundation of the merger was now so thoroughly integrated into the operation that the original document in its tin box in the Doyle Ranch house was something they consulted rarely, a foundation so solid it could be forgotten in the normal course of things, which is the best kind of foundation. Virginia ran the books still, with the same precise, unforgiving attention she had always brought to the numbers, and Frederick managed the cattle operation with the same patient, thorough energy he had always brought to work. They disagreed regularly and argued with the specific pleasure of 2 people who both know what they are talking about and respect each other enough to say so, and they were almost always better for the argument than before it. They had a particular argument about the expansion of the cattle operation in the spring of 1888 that was one of their finest, a genuine 2-day disagreement that involved a diagram drawn on the kitchen table with a pencil, several almanacs, and one extended section that consisted entirely of the 2 of them sitting in silence at opposite ends of the porch looking at the canyon and thinking, before Virginia said, "You are right about the east pasture," in the same tone she used for everything, which was direct and clear, and without any suggestion that it cost her anything, because she had long since understood that being right about the east pasture was its own reward and did not need to be. Staged, Frederick said, "And you are right about the grazing rotation." "I know," she said, "so we are both right." "We are rarely both wrong," she said, with a satisfaction that he shared entirely. Cephas Gill died in the autumn of 1889, quietly and without drama, which was entirely in character. He had been slowing for a year and they had all known it, and he had made his wishes clear with characteristic economy. He wanted to be buried on Doyle land, on the rise above the east pasture where you could see the creek and the canyon both, and he wanted the occasion not to be elaborate. They honored both requests. Virginia read a passage from his Bible, which had his name written inside in handwriting much younger than the man she knew, and Frederick said a few words that were brief and true, and Patrick, who was 4 years old and had spent more of his conscious life with Cephas nearby than not, was extremely quiet in the way that small children are when something large and real has entered their world. They stood at the grave on the rise above the east pasture, and the canyon caught the morning light, and the creek ran in its line of silver below, and the sky was the enormous, indifferent, permanent blue of the New Mexico territory at its most essential. And Virginia stood with her husband's hand in hers, and looked at the small marker with Cephas Gill's name on it, and thought about her father's marker on the same land, and felt the specific weight and meaning of a place that holds the people you have loved. "He was a good man," she said. "He was," Frederick agreed. "He told me once very early on that you were patient. That patience was the right approach." She paused. He was right. Frederick looked at her profile, the same strong angles he had been looking at for 6 years now, the same dark eyes that were as clear and direct as the day he had first seen them over the barrel of a Winchester rifle. "He was a wise man," Frederick said. Virginia leaned against his shoulder briefly, in the way she had first done on the porch the day the mortgage was paid, the weight and warmth of it still entirely new feeling after all the time between. "Come on," she said. "The children need breakfast, and the east pasture won't check itself." They walked back down from the rise together, with the canyon at their backs and the morning spreading out in front of them over their land, their operation, their life, and the sound of 2 small children inside the house reaching them across the still morning air, with the particular loud insistence of people who have things to say and are not willing to wait. Patrick met them at the door at 4 years old, with Eileen balanced on his hip in the inexpert but determined way of a child who has decided he can do something and is going to do it regardless. He looked up at them with his mother's dark eyes in his father's face and said with great seriousness, "Eileen ate my boot." "She did not eat your boot," Virginia said, taking Eileen with the practiced ease of a woman who has held this particular child for 2 years and knows her weight and warmth completely. "She bit it," Patrick said, with the precision of someone who has considered the distinction. "Boots are not for biting," Virginia told Eileen, who looked at this statement with the calm, wide gaze of a person who has her own views on the matter. Frederick held the door open and looked at the 3 of them, his family on his doorstep in the New Mexico morning, and felt the clean, complete, permanent weight of everything he had been working toward for 10 years before he rode into Redemption Creek and was told to stay away from a stubborn woman. He had said that was his favorite kind of conversation. He had been right about that in ways he could not have imagined from the back of a horse outside a gate with a carved name above it, in ways that took years to fully understand, and that he was still, in the daily discovery of a life built with someone who was exactly and thoroughly herself, in the process of understanding. "Come in," Virginia said from inside. "Coffee is made." He came in. The door closed behind him. The canyon stood in the morning light, red and gold and permanent, and the creek ran its way through the eastern pasture with the indifferent reliability of water that comes from mountains and knows where it is going. And the Barker operation spread across 400 acres of New Mexico territory with the deep-rooted, working solidity of something built right and built to last. And in the house on the hill above it, the family that had been made from stubbornness and patience, and a mortgage document with a hidden addendum, and a fence rail, and 2 days' ride to Cimarron, and a signed partnership agreement, and a wedding in October in a church with a straight steeple, ate breakfast around a table with a pencil-drawn diagram still visible in the wood from a 2-day argument about cattle management, and talked over each other in the energetic, overlapping way of people who are completely comfortable in each other's company, and plan the work of the day with the combined intelligence and conviction of 2 people who are better together than apart, which they had each known for years and were both still glad about every single morning without exception. Virginia Doyle had been stubborn past all reasoning. Frederick Barker had said that was his favorite kind of conversation. There was not a single day in the years that followed that he had reason to feel otherwise.